Our Bible reading this month, is in the book of Second Corinthians, and we are at week 3 for this podcast, which means we're going to address questions you guys have given us about the readings, and our questions come from a special group.
Yeah.
Today. Actually, we are currently doing a Bible reading class with high school kids. You know, I asked them a few months ago how many of them were doing the Bible reading.
Right.
And I got a less than stellar response. And so we decided to do a Bible reading class.
Right.
And so that's what we're doing in the current quarter with the high school kids. We're actually talking about the Bible reading in the class. And in fact, the Bible reading, the class with the high school kids sort of parallels what we're doing with the podcast. We kind of work the same question. So in week 3, we talk about whatever questions they have. So I have some questions that were posed by our teenagers, who, by the way, are doing a terrific job. Almost every kid in the class is doing the reading, and most of them are reading the whole book. So I'm really, really proud of them. They're doing a really great job.
That is great.
But they did have some questions for us that are worth, I think, exploring.
Okay.
Just showing, I think, that they're taking the reading seriously.
Yeah. Excellent.
And really doing a good job with this. So grab your Bible. Let's go to our letter for this month, 2 Corinthians, and we're going to start in chapter 3, and actually grabbing one of those slogan phrases.
Yeah.
That
Paul has a lot of those.
Well, and let's say this about it, since this is going to sort of define where I think we end up going. We're going to take a slogan and rip it from its context.
Yeah, we do that with a lot of Paul's letters.
We tend to do that with the Bible generally.
Yeah, fair.
In chapter 3 and verse 6, the kids wanted to know what it meant when it says, the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And that's one of those places in 2 Corinthians that if people have ever read the book, that's sort of a memorable spot in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet it lends itself to some misuse.
Oh, absolutely, it does. And David, as we both know, part of the solution to those kind of questions is, number one, go back and put the sentence in its context, the whole context. And in this case, I think the context of that sentence really is the chapter 3, 1 through 6. The sentence itself that your student asked about is Paul's actual conclusion statement or application of the argument he's been making for several verses. So you got to go back and see what he's been saying for several verses. And what he's been saying for several verses goes back to, he's dealing with one of the accusations the false teachers have made against him. He's not a real apostle, and so he's chasing back the idea, or he's showing the proof of his apostleship. He doesn't need letters of recommendation, from Peter or from John saying, oh, Paul's a real apostle. His point in chapter 3, was that verse 2 there, you yourselves are our letter of recommendation written on our hearts to be known and read by all. In other words, the fact that you guys have become Christians. I have done correctly the work of an apostle. I have brought you the true gospel that has resulted in your salvation. So the fact that you're Christians, you're become the letter of recommendation. I am an apostle. I know what I'm doing.
You're my proof.
You're my proof. Right. But then he goes one step further that gets us closer to this sentence.
Let me pause you one second, because I want to grab that and tie that into the book.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because the letter itself deals a lot with this. If we're talking about context,
right?
Not just here, but throughout the letter, Paul is defending his apostleship against these attacks.
That's right.
So contextually, that is what's going on, not here, but through the whole book.
That's right. That's right. All the way to the end of the book. And so having established that, the fact that you guys are Christians, you guys are my letter of recommendation, then he goes in verse 3 and he says something important that's easy to miss. And he says, and you show that you are a letter from Christ delivered by us, written not with ink, but with the Spirit of living God, not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of human hearts. And that's an allusion to the new covenant.
Right.
Jeremiah, Ezekiel, both, when they talked about the new covenant, Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36, they both talked about a covenant not written on tablets of stone.
Old Testament, Mount Sinai.
Mosaic covenant,
right,
but written on the human heart. That it's not something that you're born to and learn because you're already a Jew. You learn this. It goes to your heart in the first place. That's how you become a Christian. You're not born it. You become it innately by listening to the message. So and this is a crucial verse 3. So he's referencing the nature of the new covenant is what he's doing. So verse 4, when he goes on then, or excuse me, verse 5, not that we are sufficient in ourselves to claim anything is coming from us, but our sufficiency is from God. In other words, we're not claiming apostleship for ourselves. And if we're successful, like converting you, it's not because we're really that great. It's God's work, God's word doing the work. Verse 6, he has made us sufficient to be ministers of now he makes it explicit,
New covenant.
ministers of a new covenant, what he was alluding to before, not of the letter, but of the Spirit, for the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now we see what that sentence is contrasting.
Yep.
It's contrasting the letter of the old law written on tablets of stone
Right.
with the Spirit that gives life. The Spirit is the revealer of the new covenant that goes straight into your heart if you accept it and changes who you are, how you think, what you want, and how you live. The new covenant written on the human heart in that way, not some miraculous indwelling of the Spirit, but simply the Spirit is revealing the gospel through the apostles. And thus Paul's point, that's why it's Paul's point, so I'm a real apostle.
Yeah.
This has happened in you.
Old Testament versus New Testament is the contrast.
right.
That's not always the way people use that.
No,
verse,
they abuse
though,
it.
And do what?
Well, they'll say the letter, as in the letter is like God's strict commandments, and so following God's commandments strictly. Yeah, you should. That's good if you do. But life is in the Spirit. It's just in the feeling good about yourself. You and Jesus are in love with each other. Jesus is your boyfriend, kind of.
Or a personal experience. with the
Personal
Spirit.
experience, feelings and intentions. I meant to do good, or I know God says I shouldn't do this, but if two people love each other, that's what matters.
It's amazing to me the efforts that are made to minimize the importance of hearing the voice of God and following His instructions. Now,
Right.
there's people. There's a chronic effort to sort of trash obedience, which is exactly what God is looking for
Right.
from His people.
Right.
And that's not saying love isn't relevant. Obviously, it's one of the guiding principles.
It's a commandment itself.
It's in all of this, but at the same time, that effort to just sort of say God's not really concerned about the details of what you do,
Right.
And so in this case, it's a complete misuse
Yeah.
of what's going on. So it points up, I think, the importance of context.
It does. And let me add one more thing before
I know
we
I
leave
got
it.
away from you too quick. Sorry. about that.
No, that's fine. Just when he says the letter kills, let's underscore this thing. What he's not saying is commandments kill, but feelings and intentions, are where spirit and life are. When he says the letter kills, he's talking about the old covenant in particular, and the fact that the old covenant couldn't bring salvation, that the commandments could show you what sin is, but it's not a dichotomy between commandments kill because they condemn. It's the old law commandments could only show you your sin; they couldn't show you a way that was truly out of your sin. That's what he meant when he said the letter kills. It's not a false dichotomy between commandments are bad and intentions or feelings are good.
Right. And I think it points up how critical it is to read things in context.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons we've been encouraging you guys to even read through each of the letters in one sitting so that we do get that fuller context. We need to really guard against cherry picking things, removing them from their setting, and wind up doing something not just that ignores what Paul was doing, but in this case is actually teaching something that isn't true.
Right.
Great danger. Need to be careful about that.
Right.
So the second question we got came from this same context. It's a little bit later. So go on down through chapter 3 a little further, because beginning in verse 12 and going through really the end of the chapter, he talks about this veil. And so one of our high school students was wanting to know what the veil is. And as it turns out, that's a pretty complicated issue, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a challenging paragraph. I mean, it's really verses 12 through 18, that whole paragraph.
Right.
And again, context is going to be crucial here. And to start consideration of this, two things you got to know about the context to do right by this passage. Number one, understand it's referring to a story in Exodus chapter 34. And the quick 10-second summary of the story is when Moses came back down from Mount Sinai from being in the presence of God, the glory of God on the mountain was so overwhelming that Moses himself was glowing. His face was shining with the glory of God upon him. That scared the people, Exodus 34 tells us. And so Moses started wearing a veil over his face except when he was speaking to them. Exodus 34 will say that he would only take the veil off to either speak to God when he'd go into the tent of meeting or to speak speak to the people, but otherwise to kind of not make the people nervous or fearful, he wore a veil over his face. So that's the story underneath what Paul is alluding to here. The second thing is the context. Verse 11 is Paul's point. Verses 12 through 18 are Paul explaining the point. Verse 11, this is the whole point of what 12 through 18 is driving toward. They're just an illustration. For if what was being brought to an end, in other words, the Mosaic covenant, we were just talking about that earlier in the chapter,
Right.
context.
Right. Context.
So if what was being brought to an end came with glory, all the glory on Sinai, so much glory, Moses is glowing with the experience of bringing that covenant, that law down. How much more will what is permanent have glory? In other words, the new covenant. So that was the contrast earlier in the chapter. Paul's done a little bit more since then, but verse 11 is the key point. If there was this much glory, so much that Moses glowed after bringing this covenant down from the mountain presence of God, how much more is what we have with the Spirit giving life in this new covenant written on our hearts, than what came before. Yeah. And verses 12 through 18 then take that story, run with it. But that's the point.
Okay, it's so picking up then, that's actually helpful because in 13, when it says Moses, who used to put a veil over his face, when someone asks, well, what is the veil?
Yeah.
Well, actually, he talks about more than one here.
Yeah,
The first one is the literal covering.
He literally veiled his face.
Looking back at the Exodus story that Moses put over his face.
Right.
To hide the glory from the children of Israel,
right? Because
it was frightening with them, which is interesting. I'm tempted to go down that path too. But then you get to 14, and he seems to. I'm sorry, not 14. Still at 13, going on through the end of 13, he seems to do something else with that because he says Moses, who used to put a veil over his face, so that the sons of Israel would not look intently at the end of what was fading away. And now he seems to broaden that out as though there's something more going on here than just the physical veil on his face.
Correct. And again, now you've got this, it's moving from the literal to the metaphorical, right?
Right.
Because, part of what it may mean, this is debated, no room for dogmatism, but did Moses' face kind of permanently shine, or did it fade over time? But certainly the idea here seems to be that regardless, the covenant itself would fade, so to speak, in time. And so the outcome, literally the telos in Greek, the goal, the purpose, so that the old law itself, even in the Pentateuch, contained within it hints of something beyond itself, the Messianic age, something beyond itself that would be fuller, more complete, more permanent, more glorious. And so even the law of Moses itself contained hints. But part of, I think, the Old Testament in general's point is it was somewhat veiled. The people did not get it. And you even see that later, like in Luke chapter 24, after Jesus' resurrection, when Jesus then, after the resurrection, explains to them the law and the prophets. It's like now that the Christ event, crucifixion and resurrection, has happened, now God can unveil what was hidden in the law and the prophets the whole time, but they didn't have the key, crucifixion and resurrection of the Messiah, to make sense of.
Even they didn't get it.
Yeah, that's
Even
right.
The prophets didn't really get what they were writing, right? Since they were veiled.
Yes.
And so from there he goes on, in 14 to talk about still another veil.
Yes.
Because he says, but their minds were hardened, for until this very day, at the reading of the Old Covenant, the same veil remains unlifted because it is removed in Christ. But to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their heart. So there's another kind of veil yet that he gets to.
Right.
And it's the one preventing people of that time, of Paul's time, from seeing the truth about the Old Covenant.
That's right. And the key phrase, again, just like we were saying in verse 14, only through Christ is it taken away. Only by listening to the gospel of Jesus Christ will that veil be lifted. Jesus himself lifts the veil, in a sense, in Luke 24 for those two people. And so if you're not going to let Christ explain what was, so to speak, hidden, veiled in the law and the prophets the whole time. Because that's the thing, is now the apostles themselves proclaim the gospel from the law and the prophets. They go, it's one of Paul's things, he go in the synagogues and do, open the law and prophets and show how Jesus fulfilled these things. He can take away the veil of what was hidden in there. But verse 14, the beginning of it, their minds are hardened.
Yeah, see, when you said you talked about the key phrase in 14, I thought that's where you were heading. The veil, in a sense, is their hardened
Now it is.
hearts.
Now it
They
is.
prevent them. That prevents them from seeing.
Right. So now you're like, again, going back to the story that Paul's referring to here. It's not God's command. It's not necessarily Moses' idea. The fact that the people themselves were frightened is why the veil came to be in Exodus 34. And so, part of what Paul's getting at is it's always been this way, that too often the Jewish people have hardened their hearts to what God is trying to say to them. Even before the coming of Christ, they would harden their hearts. The prophets talked about that anyways. But Jesus himself talks about basically, I am a stone of stumbling. I am a rock of offense. And so once again, the Jews are, in a sense, recoiling from the unveiled glory of God, what he's offering them. And choosing by hardening their hearts to put the veil back.
So what you could say about this is that some of them had always chosen the veil over seeing the glory of God.
Yeah.
You got to preach a sermon about that.
That
Sounds like it's choosing the veil.
Yeah, no, that's right.
Yeah, that'd freak everybody out with the title anyway. So
wonder what you meant by that.
yeah, that's exactly right. Choosing the veil. All right, let's jump ahead to chapter 6 because we had a question. Probably one we could have anticipated coming into this letter.
Yeah, one of the more famous passages in this book as well.
Yeah. Someone asked about this segment toward the end of chapter 14. Do not be bound together with unbelievers, for what partnership have righteousness and lawlessness, or what fellowship has light and darkness, or what harmony has Christ with Belial, or what has a believer in common with an unbeliever? We'll just pause there. But the question was,
You get the idea.
yeah, what is he talking about there? Now, traditionally, I think people have thought about marriage.
Yeah.
And marriage to an unbeliever
right.
when they read this text. I think that's probably too small.
It's bigger than that. I think Paul's talking about bigger than that. Not that marriage might not fall under the umbrella, but the umbrella is bigger. And the key is to understand the image he's using, yoked to an unbeliever. What is a yoke? It's yoke is when you put two animals on a farm, in a harness.
How do you know about that?
Huh?
How do you know about that?
I read a book once.
I was going to say, you're not a farm boy.
I'm a city slicker. No, I read a book once or saw.
We should have put a slide up with that picture.
Yeah, I was going to say, right? Yeah. But the ancient world, everybody was a farmer. Everybody knew that, and so yeah. But the yoke is you got two animals, and the key is because of the yoke, what one does, the other has to do.
Right. They pull together.
They either pull together, but if one is stronger or more influential, they may pull the weaker animal to the right or to the left. Right. But the bottom line is you have to go together wherever it is, for good or for ill. You are stuck together. And so that kind of yoking, it could be certain kinds of business relationships where there are legal obligations, that you have to each other. It could be all sorts of but relationships where there's some sort of, at least formal, perhaps legal, but you're stuck together. You have to go to the same place.
Yeah, it seems to me that even culture understands the danger connected about that. If you get yourself into a crowd of people bent on doing the wrong thing,
right,
you're going to get swept up in that.
You're going to be carried along with it.
You're going to be carried along with it. And so it seems to me that what the Spirit is trying to tell us is not just resist the urge to be carried along, but think about even before that, not putting yourself in a situation where you're going to have to resist.
Right.
Don't get in this situation where you find yourself caught up in a group that are doing things that are not who you are and not where you want to be.
Right. No, that's exactly right. I think that's and that's Paul's concern is you're not going to drag them where they need to be. They're going to drag you where you shouldn't be. And that's, those of us who have lived long enough, we know that's often what happens. People may get themselves in certain situations with the best of intentions or thinking that they're strong enough not to be carried away, and yet they aren't.
Yeah, and by way of application, you certainly could see that as an application for young people. You get it, you go off to school and you get yourself wrapped up in a fraternity and there's the pressure of the crowd to do what that crowd is doing.
Right.
And before you know it,
right,
you've fallen into that. But I think it would have a marriage application as well, to be concerned. For example, I've known some people married to non-Christians And they ran into some difficult spots with their children because your
Right.
unbelieving spouse dragging that way
Right.
and you pulling the other way.
Right.
And how do you get that resolved?
And the kids get mixed messages, or or maybe even choose the easier path with the worldly parent.
And maybe the better question is, okay, why did I put myself in this situation to begin
Right.
with? Maybe we ought to think about that
Right.
first. Do I really need to enter into these kind of relationships, these kind of settings where all the momentum is going against who I want to be and what I want to do?
Right. And to that end, I think it's important to finish the actual section there, David, because I think, it's one of those classic, and you and I have talked about this in other settings before. When people ask the question, what's wrong with this? That's not the best question. The better question is what's right with this, right? If we learn more to seek what's right as opposed to just avoiding what's wrong, we're generally going to make better decisions, more godly decisions that lead to maturity and better outcomes. And so you look at what Paul says there, second half of verse 16, for we are the temple of the living God, as God said. And then he quotes a bunch of Old Testament references to God dwelling among his people and being their God, they shall be my people. Therefore, go out from their midst and be separate, and begins to invoke the language of holiness. And so that's the thing is, if we remember our goal in life before God, if we're Christians, is to be holy. Not to live as close to the world, or we might get ourselves yoked to it in a way that's going to bring unfortunate, if even eternally dangerous consequences. The goal is to be holy, to maintain the right kind of separation from the world, not an arrogant Pharisaical one, but to understand part of holiness is a separation. I cannot get myself yoked to the world in ways that are going to violate my holiness to the Lord. And so I think about myself as holy to the Lord first, which is Paul's point in the second half of this section. If I think about myself that way and realize that's who I am, again, it's gonna make me a lot more self-aware and the kind of things I get myself yoked to in the first place.
Yeah, and so I think there would be some pushback. I think some people would hear that and they would say, well, it sounds like Jeff is saying you just shouldn't even have any friends that aren't
Not
Christians.
at all.
And I would say it depends.
Yeah.
Because I do think we ought to ponder more
Yeah.
our relationships with people who fundamentally see the world differently than
Right.
we do. So I actually would agree with your initial response. It isn't that you can't have a friend who is not a Christian, but I do think we ought to really consider who we spend our time with in a crisis, who we go to, whose voice that we hear.
Sure.
9 days out of 10, they might not be a big deal, but who you listen to, who you go to in a crisis on that last day may be life-altering for you, or under the wrong circumstances, 10 years down the road, that crowd you chose to be part of could be life-altering for you. And so I do think that there is wisdom in saying, when it comes to the people I'm spending my time with, that I'm going to in a crisis, whose voice I hear, plug in some Psalm 1 here.
Yeah.
That needs to be the people that are heading the direction I am going, not a crowd I'm always having that creates a current I'm always resisting.
Right.
That's unhealthy for us.
Well, part of what I think it's exactly right. I think part of what we need to do as we're forming our relationships in life is think about friendship at different levels. Right. There's, because we use that word friend very broadly. There's a difference between an acquaintance and a best friend, but we might colloquially use friend to cover all of that.
Right.
But you're right. I mean, if my best friend, the person I turn to exactly for marital advice, for, parenting advice, but there's somebody of the world,
something's wrong with that picture.
Something's wrong with that picture, and we need to be intentionally cultivating our deepest relationships among people who share our God, our faith, and therefore our journey.
Yeah,
that's exactly right.
Absolutely. Well, I think our teens had some really, really great questions for our 2 Corinthians segment. Encourage our young people as they're doing the Bible reading. I'm really, really excited about that. And if you have more questions, it is a 5 Sunday month, so we may actually have an opportunity to do some more questions. We're gonna read through again this week and come back with some applications. I think we've already kind of slipped into that today.
Yeah, we did.
We want to come back and do some applications next week. But if you do have some more questions, we might have some time to work on that as well. Again, we want to encourage you to keep up the reading and enjoy this great letter to the Corinthians.